Into this episode of Remnant Radio. My name is Joshua Lewis, and today we are going to be discussing the proof of the resurrection. I've got Justin Bass, I just realized I need to mute this, on the other line, and we're going to be discussing that today. But before we do that, I want to let you know who we are and what we do as a ministry. Remnant Radio is a theology broadcast. We interview pastors and teachers from different churches and denominations. We invite them to come on our show so we can suspend our presuppositions momentarily and learn from Christian brothers from different traditions, denominations. It's been a fun show. We interview pastors like N.T. Wright, Craig Keener, Wayne Grudem, tons of pastors and teachers within the sphere of orthodoxy. If that's something you might be interested in, go ahead and hit that subscribe button as we are coming out with content just like this. To my left, your right, I have got Pastor Michael Roundtree. Pastor, that just sounds weird.
Does it sound that weird?
Got Mikey right here. Pastor Mike.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. So glad to have you. And he is right. You definitely want to hit that subscribe button because we have tons of content coming out. 2 episodes at least every single week. Last week we interviewed Dr. Tim Mackey with the Bible Project. Incredible episode on spiritual beings. Absolutely fascinating. So that was last week. We also did an interview like, is there such a thing as a balanced charismatic? And we kind of tried to navigate that little world there. Had Michael Miller on the show, a former co-host of Remnant Radio. That episode's getting a lot of traction. And last night, Josh and I had a conversation about the documentary American Gospel. Because we interviewed somebody from the kind of, I don't know, what tradition would you call it? Pentecostal / Word of Faith-ish tradition. I don't know what you call Todd White.
Yeah, whatever that amoebus
whatever that is. We interviewed him, and some people are like, well, what's going on? Where do you guys stand on things? And so, and he was featured in the American Gospel documentary, and so we just went ahead and put a little commentary on the American Gospel documentary.
Yep.
So, great episode last night, but this week, super excited. Today, we have Justin Bass, and this guy is a scholar of scholars, PhD from Dallas Theological Seminary, and he wrote a book called The Bedrock of Christianity. I've read the book. I have it right here. Great read. If you are into apologetics, or if you simply want to be just more grounded in your faith, this is going to be a really helpful book. And we're going to be discussing the contents of this book today. Justin Bass is on the line with us. Justin, could you introduce us to yourself? Tell us, I kind of introduced you, but maybe tell us a little bit more about yourself. And so could you tell us a little bit more?
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I really appreciate the introduction, and really honored to be on with you guys. And basically, I'm a professor of New Testament at Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary. A mouthful, but people say JETS for short. But it's in Amman, Jordan. Nice. It's probably the largest evangelical theological seminary in the Middle East. And so people from that part of the world, they come there and they're trained from Egypt, from Iraq, even from parts of North Africa. Even I've had South Korean students as well. And so it's an incredible place. And so I've been there for the last 3 years. I'm in Texas right now due to promoting the book, but also, as I shared before, I got stuck here because of COVID. So, but praise the Lord, I love being in the United States of Texas because I am a true Texan.
Yes.
If we want to succeed, that will be fine with me. Texas is my home.
He's like, I'll be in Jordan anyway. It doesn't even matter.
So I love Texas. This is where I'm born and raised. But the Lord called us to go about 3 years ago to the Middle East, and so when the Lord says that, you obey. And so
yeah,
been blessed to be there and serving there. We also serve refugees through an NGO there. Refugees coming in that really fled from ISIS, from Syria, from Iraq, and even the war-torn Yemen right now. Right before I left, we were getting some refugees from Yemen. So yeah, it's been an incredible opportunity to serve the Lord there and see the name of Christ lifted high in the Middle East.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about your book, Bedrock? What is this about? What are the things that you cover in this book, so that people understand once we kind of get through this conversation today, if they want to study more, this would be the place to do it. Can you kind of explain what this is about?
Yeah, kind of the heart of the book, as I've shared, and really what inspired me to write it was, years and years of seminary and then PhD. I kept seeing more and more of these facts, what I call bedrock facts, that just are agreed upon across the board, whether you're a Jewish scholar, atheist, agnostic, Catholic, Protestant, liberal, conservative. It just doesn't matter. If you dive into this world, if you have credentials in this world, there are certain facts that are just unalterable, that are just bedrock. And so I wanted to put all those in one place, kind of a one-stop shop that specifically deal with Jesus' death and resurrection. So, of course, there are many bedrock facts beyond just what I share in that book from the Gospels and other places, throughout the Old Testament. But when it comes to the Jesus' death and resurrection, these are the bedrock facts that I think support and lead a person to confess that Jesus is risen from the dead. And so that was really what inspired me to write it. There were other reasons, but that's I think a good summary of what the book's about. But I go into all kinds of really time traveling through history, and so we learn about all kinds of other historical figures and compare them to Jesus. So I think it was fun to put together. I'm glad y'all liked it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's just dive in, and you talk about the bedrock facts of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And so let's just start with the death of Jesus / person of Jesus. Can we say that it's a bedrock fact that a historical man, Jesus of Nazareth, lived and died on a cross? I mean, do unbelieving historians stand by that? Is there anybody besides the crazy outlier who believes otherwise, who is a historian?
Yeah. It's not. It may not even be worth mentioning the crazy outlier, which would be the Holocaust deniers. I mean, mythicists. That's people who identify as mythicists are the people basically in YouTube comments, and they post on Facebook, and these are the people that will say Jesus didn't exist. But as far as people who actually have PhDs in these areas of history, of ancient history, of classics, of biblical studies, I say in the book, 99.9% across the board would not only say that Jesus just existed, but they would say a number of things we can know about Jesus. And when we talk about Jesus existing and the crucifixion, I like what John Dominic Crossan, a very, very liberal scholar, the way he put it. He said that Jesus is crucified is as certain as anything can be. Is as certain as anything can be. I think that's a good way to say it, because of course we know that we could be in the matrix. So then studying history isn't very helpful. But if history is reliable, if these tools of history are reliable, then if we can know anything about history, then the crucifixion of Jesus is as certain as anything could be. And I could lay out for you, it's in the book, but I could also lay out for you right here just a ton of the firsthand sources that we have, not just in the New Testament, but also outside the New Testament, Greek, Jewish, Roman writers from the first century that testify not only to Jesus's the historical Jesus, but also the fact that he was crucified. So I'd put it on par with Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. I mean, I think these are just certain Archimedean points of history.
So what would those tools be? So, you mentioned firsthand accounts, those kinds of records. What would be the different tools in which that you're going to weigh any historical event and use those same tools to then weigh the death and burial, resurrection of Christ?
Yeah, I mean, the primary tools that we have really, beyond a couple hundred years ago is pretty much written. I mean, that's pretty much is what has survived, that where we have written, reliable eyewitness, people who were alive at the time that in some way were involved or at least knew somebody who was an eyewitness to the event. Now, in some cases, we have things like the destruction of the temple. You can go to Jerusalem, as I've been, and you can actually touch the stones that were thrown down, just as Jesus said, every stone will be thrown down. You can touch some of those stones and see the ruins, and you can see the wall. The Wailing Wall is basically the one of the retaining walls that was under the temple. The temple would have been on top of that wall, and so we have ruins, we have inscriptions, we have all kinds of archaeological type corroboration for a ton of things of history. But I'd say across the board, the number one way we know about historical persons is from written evidence. And so that gets us into the written evidence about Jesus, things like Paul's early letters, the Gospels, Acts, and then even outside of the New Testament, like the Jewish historian Josephus, Tacitus, the Roman historian. These are some of the examples of these would be those firsthand tools, the best that we have to know about someone from the first century, like Jesus.
Right, but haven't there also been historical events, or I say historical events, but like historical stories or myths that have been passed along as if they were factual in history. I mean, there were certainly cult groups, there were certainly other religious groups that had
Like
stories and
Joseph
firsthand
Smith
accounts.
found golden tablets.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who would have firsthand accounts of that. I mean, how do I compare a cultish religion that kind of came up out of nothing? We got the golden age of myth was around the time of Jesus, right? You got your
all the
Egyptian
Gnostic
myths,
Gospels.
you got your Gnostics, you got your Greek myths. I mean, why is this not just one of those myths?
Well, that's the thing. It goes to how early and who is writing it and how close they were to the actual event they're describing. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And when it comes to Jesus, that's exactly what we have. We have early and reliable accounts from actual eyewitnesses to what happened. I mean, Joseph Smith's a great example. So when it comes to Joseph Smith, I talk about this in the book, his claim that the angel Moroni appeared to him and that Jesus and God the Father, two personages, appeared to him at one time. I mean, what is this based on? It's all based on Joseph Smith. So we're dealing with one witness, one eyewitness that if we look at his character, I don't think he would pass the credibility of a court of law today. For so many reasons. Most of the contemporaries at the time of Joseph Smith believed he was a con artist, and of course he, slept with many of the wives of his followers. I mean, this isn't a Martin Luther King Jr. This isn't a Nelson Mandela. So when we look at people like Paul and we look at the earliest disciples, we have every reason to trust them. They are in every way presented as reliable. And we have multiple witnesses in the case, as we can talk about the case of the resurrection of Jesus. We have Peter, we have Paul, we have James, his brother, we have 500 at one time, we have the 12, we have the women. So we have all these different witnesses to this supernatural event. Joseph Smith is just one example. We only have him. And then when you deal with like Greek mythological stories, when Hercules went on his 12 labors, what's our source for that? I mean, we're dealing with writings from Greek authors about 1,000 years after the proposed event took, like Hercules' 12 labors. I think they took place, according to the mythology, around the time that we would date the story of Judges. So around the time of the Judges, Hercules was doing these things. But where's our sources? Again, they go back to, I think, Ovid and some of these guys from the 1st century BC. So we're talking like many centuries, and in many cases, even 1,000 years later, these proposed stories are happening. And so, again, you just follow the evidence where it leads. And in most of those cases, they lead to mythological stories that you can't trust. But in the case of the stories of Jesus and his earliest disciples, I think they lead us to a risen Lord, to supernatural events.
Okay, so I've heard you mention several things, the early dating, the corroboration from other eyewitnesses and other sources, and we've compared some of the other religions and other mythological claims. But then we get to Christianity and we have the Gospels, we have 1 Corinthians 15. That's the one I want to specifically focus on because you spend a lot of time in your book talking about this early church creed in 1 Corinthians 15. And I'd like for you to explain that because it seems like if I was a skeptic, I might say, hey, you can't use the Bible to prove your Jesus is true or that he really rose from the dead. These are biased sources, and these are people who are trying to get you to believe something. This isn't something from the outside. And so why can we go to this creed in 1 Corinthians 15? And before you answer that question, I want to actually read the creed just to familiarize our readers with it. This is chapter 15, starting in verse 3. And so this is the Apostle Paul quoting, but scholars say that this was an early church creed. So, for I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then to more than 500, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep, then to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So why can we use the Bible to show that Jesus rose again, specifically 1 Corinthians 15?
Yeah, great question. And this really is the key place to begin. I mean, and this is what I focus on in the book. As you said, I call it the bedrock source of Christianity, because what we have in 1 Corinthians 15, not necessarily the chapter, but what Paul quotes, what you just read within 1 Corinthians 15, goes back to within, it actually dates to within possibly months after Jesus' death, but at most a decade after Jesus' death. Basically, across the board, scholars would average date that creed that you just read to around 5 years after Jesus' death, which is truly, when you compare it to any other ancient event or historical person, it's almost unparalleled. It's an incredible thing. And this whole idea of you can't use the Bible to prove the Bible, that is a common statement that's brought up. I would point people to the great agnostic scholar Bart Ehrman, who wrote a book called "Did Jesus Exist?" refuting the mythicists that we were talking about earlier. And he actually has a whole section trying to explain to people how scholarship works, and that the Bible, even if whether you believe it's the Word of God or not, it's a compilation of historical documents. And so the question is are they trustworthy historical documents, or are they not? And so for someone like Bart Ehrman, he's weighing each one and each claim and saying, okay, I believe this is historical, I believe this is not historical. But when it comes to like 1 Corinthians 15, he and everyone across the board, like I said, 99.9% of the scholars, even mythicists actually would agree on this point. The few of those who have published in this area, they would agree that this creed goes back, like I said, to within that first decade, sometime in the 30s AD, and was composed by the original followers of Jesus. So where did Paul get this creed? He probably got it when he hung out with Peter for 2 weeks in Jerusalem. I mean, how cool was that? Peter was hanging out with Paul. They went fishing. They went to the temple. It
was an ancient Remnant Radio. No, that's probably not okay to say. Okay, go ahead.
I mean, it doesn't actually say that, but it actually says they spent 2 weeks together. And again, this is a bedrock fact. They spent 2 weeks together. It's just fun to use your historical imagination and imagine, what did Peter and Paul do? If you've been to Jerusalem, again, it's a small place. It's not that big. I mean, they probably walked around to the very places, where Peter denied Jesus, the place where Jesus was crucified, the empty tomb. I mean, Paul probably saw all those things. And so they hung out during that time. And then after that, he plants the church of Corinth, and he delivers to them this creedal statement that says he appeared to Peter, he appeared to James. And it was during that time that when he was in Jerusalem hanging out with Peter, that he probably received that very information. And so that's how we can know that it's so early. And many of the claims that are within it are corroborated in what we find in the Gospels later. And so we just have so many reasons to trust that creed because of the robust evidence, not just because all scholars agree on this across the board.
So I keep hearing you say all scholars agree on this, or 99% of scholars agree on this. How much of this conversation, because I think a lot of people would come to this approach and assume that it is in fact apologetic, that it's for those who are outside of the Christian faith. How much of this is a necessity today for the attack of like liberalism inside of the Christian faith? And I say liberalism, just obviously not politically, people who are familiar with the show, but for those who might not be. When I'm saying liberal theology, to look at these things as basically a Christian myth that can inform us and help us, but didn't actually happen. How important are these things? And is there a danger in saying, okay, all guys agree on these things, and they don't agree on all these other things?
Yeah.
How do you cipher through that? Because it sounds like you're definitely want to make a strong case for the apologetic side for those who don't have faith in Christ. This was a historical event, but it also seems that we might be giving up ground for those liberal theologians. So how do we stay in a safe space there?
No, it's an excellent point, and this is kind of my apologetic method, my modus operandi kind of thing. I like to go to the common ground. I like to go to the place where we all agree. And I feel like I'm following in the line of people like Justin Martyr from the early church. When he debated Trypho, he only argued from the Old Testament that Trypho, the Jew, also agreed on. I think even going back to Jesus, when he debated with the Sadducees about the resurrection, he didn't quote from Daniel, which would have been, the key text for resurrection, because they didn't believe in the book of Daniel. They believed only in the Torah, in the first 5 books. And so he quotes from Exodus. And of course, Paul quotes from the philosophers and Athens. So you could go down the list through church history. I think you have this kind of, okay, well, let's meet people where they're at. And so I'm kind of writing from the scholarly standpoint. So I say, okay, where do all scholars just agree? And they just happen to agree, and this is why I'm so passionate about it, on the things that I think point definitively to the truth of the resurrection, which if the resurrection happened, then, I think, you can then say, okay, but I still don't trust certain parts of the Bible. But that to me is unlikely. I mean, if you believe Jesus rose from the dead, and he himself, quoted from Jonah and referred to Adam and Eve and referred to Moses and on and on. I mean, if he rose from the dead, what he believed about the Bible was probably true also.
Yeah, the sufficiency of Scripture, if you believe that a man born of a virgin rose from the dead, the sufficiency of Scripture is kind of like small potatoes in comparison to this eternal.
Yeah,
exactly. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to start.
sure.
I'm starting with the foundation, the most important point, to then get to the other. So then once I establish this, then I'm ready to debate some of those other issues that seemingly I've given ground, but really I haven't. I'm just, let's start here, and now we can debate whether Jonah was a myth or Job was a myth or Matthew wrote Matthew or 2 Peter should be a part of the New Testament, things like that.
Gotcha.
Right.
That
Okay.
are highly debated.
Maybe, Justin, maybe you could help us kind of step into the mind of a historian for a moment, because when you talk about this creed that was put together within 10 years and maybe as early as within 3 or 4 or 5 years of the resurrection, to some people, they might be saying, well, that doesn't sound like that soon after. Like if I was called in as a witness to a car wreck and it was 9 years later, how much detail am I going to remember? And so what would you say to somebody who comes in and says, well, even 10 years doesn't sound like that early?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I mean, I think when we're dealing with the fact that it's the claim that a guy rose from the dead and appeared to me, I think that's where maybe the parallel.
It's the nature of it.
Yeah, the nature of it, I think we should compare to things like that. I mean, a good example is really anything from the ancient world that we have, whether it be other supernatural claims or other historical figures. People, will just, like, if you take any, introductory class on Buddhism or, on Roman history, on certain Roman Caesars, you're going to learn certain facts about these persons. And in all of those cases, if we look at them one by one, I could show you how we're talking about not only decades, but really 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And in the case of like Buddha from Buddhism, for example, I mean, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of years after do we have the writings about that person. And so in the historical framework, it's only within about 10 years. But also you have the continuous corroboration from the multiple eyewitnesses. You don't just have one person that saw, let's say, the car wreck. You have all these different people who saw it and can point to and they'll, just as we see in the Gospels, there's going to be different details when you have many different eyewitnesses. That's exactly what we find in cases today. If someone shoots somebody, you have all these different details, but the thing that's agreed upon is how they shot is the fact that they were shot. I think in this case, that's what we have. We have many different details, but we have the resurrection. He appeared to me. He spoke to me. That's what is kind of the foundational fact that they all agree on.
Yeah, so it seems as if these guys are able to corroborate with one another's stories. How does the biblical story, the biblical narrative, corroborate with other historical events and historical timelines, as far as we have in kind of Roman culture and during the life?
Josephus or
yeah,
any of that
some of
kind
these
of
other
stuff?
guys. Do the biblical outlines and dates and geographical locations line up with some of these extra biblical sources?
Yeah. I mean, in every way. I mean, Josephus, like I said, mentions he talks about Jesus in two different places in his Antiquities, and this large book, 20 volumes that he wrote. And in one, he talks about the fact that Jesus had a brother named James. He actually tells us how James was, and how.
Oh, let's try that again. I think we might have lost you. You said he had a
Josephus.
brother James, and he talked about how his brother James, and then you cut out.
Am I breaking out?
Yeah, you're good now.
Okay,
so just start back up with James. There you go.
Okay.
So Josephus was talking about James ...
So Josephus was talking about James and as the brother of Jesus, and Josephus actually tells us how James was martyred in Jerusalem by the high priest at that time because he was basically jealous of James. He actually gives us Josephus actually favors James in the debate, which is incredible. But in the context, he says James, the brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ. And then if you look at Galatians 1:19, Paul says he met with James, who is the brother of the Lord. And so here you have this amazing corroboration. It's very unlikely Josephus had ever read Galatians. You just have this corroboration of the fact that Jesus had a brother named James from both these individuals. And you could do the same with the crucifixion being under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. I mean, Pontius Pilate only reigned 10 years, and Tacitus and Josephus tell us that he was crucified during that time, just as the Gospels place him during that time. I mean, that's the amazing thing. All of these characters that you find in the Gospels, you also find the Herods, all of them you pretty much find in Josephus and in these other writings. And in every way, they corroborate with one another. There's many examples, but yeah, I find in every way agreeing with the portrait we get in the New Testament.
So in your book, you talk about, so speaking of the martyrdom of James, you talk about the martyrdom of James, Paul, and Peter, that every historian agrees upon these three were martyred. Now, church tradition holds there were a lot more martyrs than that and more of the apostles dying, but for their faith. But these three specifically, every historian will agree upon. Can you tie that into, because they're all mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, what's the relevance of these three being martyred and the credibility of their claim of resurrection? Yeah, and just to be clear, I'll answer that. Just to be clear, though, that maybe I'm not as clear as I should be in the book, but that point about their martyrdom, what I say is that there is strong historical evidence for those three, the strongest we have for any of the martyrdoms. And there are many skeptical scholars like Bart Ehrman, for example, who accepts that. But I don't put those points on the Bedrock Fact high bar of like 99%. Just FYI, because your listeners who might be looking into this, they would find that no, there's a lot of people that actually dispute the martyrdom of James. Okay. Well, is there any one of them that every historian agrees upon? Maybe Peter or maybe Paul? Or I would say Peter and Paul have the most. That would be something I would need to look more into. I think one of the people that throws it off is this female scholar. Her name is escaping me right now. I even follow her on Twitter, but her name's escaping me. But she wrote The Myth of Persecution. And she just doesn't come out and support. She argues these certain bedrock martyrdoms from the early church, and then the rest she says are like Justin Martyr, for example. She says is bedrock. Polycarp is bedrock. You also you did sorry to interrupt. You did mention James though from Josephus. Mm-hmm. There's a corroborating non-Christian source. Exactly. I mean, that's. Do we get to count that as bedrock? I think we should. I mean, that's the thing. I would need to do some more studying on that to make sure that there's no one that but I haven't found anybody other than her. She just doesn't. She has a real popular book on that, and she just doesn't come out and say that Peter and Paul. And James, I'm convinced that happened, but I'd love to debate her and see why. Yeah. And so when I find someone like that, I'm wondering, is there other people then that question this? But overwhelmingly, I would put it in the 90th percentile. Overwhelmingly, these are martyrdoms that are solid historically, and there's no reason to doubt them. Like you said, we have them even in Josephus. But the reason why they're so important too is because those the three we have the strongest evidence for, also just happen to be the three that are mentioned in that 1 Corinthians 15 creedal statement, which is amazing. So we know that those three believe they saw Jesus, and we also know, as best as we can know historically, that they died believing it, that they died because of the fact that they were confessing Jesus as Lord. Peter and Paul, we already talked about James, but Peter and Paul would have died during the Nero, the persecutions under Emperor Nero, which were basically hunting down Christians, blaming them for that fire in Rome that I'm sure while he was drunk, he caused himself. So that's why those three are so important. Right. But I want to be careful with the Bedrock Facts because, there's always somebody out there that'll come out and say, oh, no. That's only 90th percentile. It doesn't count.
One of the arguments used quite a bit in talking about the kind of eyewitness accounts that we have is the 500 that saw Christ rise into the clouds. These 500 are quoted, like Luke. I believe it's Luke who talks about these were the collection of people who saw this because he was writing this historical account. Does this count as one vote, or does this count as 500 votes? I'm curious, in the historical record, can we claim that 500 people saw him if we don't have 500 first-hand eyewitnesses, or does it count as one person who saw? I'm curious how the
were
history
these like
math
normal,
works.
like, pastor, like, how big is your church? It's 500.
No. I mean, like,
If it includes
it's
children,
one thing.
if it includes children, it's 500.
Right. There you go. Yeah, and the pregnant woman counts twice. Right. Yeah. So when I was just referring to, like, if I just told someone a spectacular story, right, and I would say, hey, there was this event that took place at church. The scaffolding opened and descended an angel, and they're like, that's a ridiculous story. There's no way that's true. And I go, yeah, that's totally true. There was like 500 people there who saw it with me. Does that only count as one testimony, or does that count as 500 eyewitnesses? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, how does the history
valid
math
is that? Yeah.
add up?
That's a great point. I think it depends on that point. It would depend on does the person claiming the 500, can he, basically introduce those 500 to those people he's writing to, and each of them say, yeah, I saw it, yeah, I saw it, yeah, I saw it. And so the question is how credible is Paul really when he gives this testimony?
Well,
this
right.
This is a great segue though from the martyrdom, because I put this on the same level. So the 500, I make the point in the book that the 500 and the to all the apostles, just because that's more ambiguous, those two in the creedal statement aren't bedrock in the sense that everyone across the board, 99.9%, agree that they believe Jesus appeared to them, that this appearance actually happened. They would say, Peter, Paul, definitely, they believe Jesus appeared to them. No one debates that at all. The 500, they do debate. Even Bart Ehrman, he has some discussions in his book on this and tries to get rid of this. And I think it's because of how powerful it is, how amazing a testimony, that there's a force to this argument, that it's an incredible claim. And it's amazing that we have it in the earliest testimony. So this isn't something, this seems like something that should come from the later, like you mentioned before, the Gnostic Gospels, or the Gospels that we see coming in the 2nd century, like the Gospel of Peter, for example, that scholars date to about 150 plus AD. It talks about how when the women went to the tomb, the cross burst out of the tomb and it followed them and started speaking to them. I mean, this is the kind of thing. And then you can imagine right after that, it says, and then he appeared to 500 people at the same time. That's what we have in Paul's earliest testimony. So there's really no reason to doubt it, I don't think. And I think we have, there are many skeptical scholars who would agree there was some kind of appearance that Paul knew about. And one of the strongest reasons is he mentions how many are still alive. And that's, I think, what Paul, so exactly what you were saying. I said, 500 people saw it, but then the person says, okay, well, let me talk to some of them. And you're like, oh, I don't remember their names. I don't know who they are. Paul was able to say, hey, go to Jerusalem. I can introduce you to them. I think that's pretty much what he's saying. He's saying, hey, go on holiday. And we know people traveled back and forth from Corinth and Jerusalem. And he's saying, hey, most of these people are still alive. So more than 250 of the 500 were still alive at the time Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, that when he wrote 1 Corinthians 15. And so they were readily available for investigation to talk about the fact that they saw the risen Jesus. So in every way, I think we should trust this account. I think it's based on the credibility of Paul, and the credibility of Paul is agreed upon by everyone. And so that's why I always laugh when they try to dismiss this one. And it's really just because of how powerful it is as a testimony to the fact that Jesus rose from the dead.
Okay. Now, Justin, could you address maybe appearances of Mary? Because Roman Catholics, go to this shrine, go to this place, and, Mary might appear to you, or she appeared to all these people at once. Could, as Protestants, well, I'm not even going there. We keep almost touching on the Roman Catholic thing. But my question is, how is this different from that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I got some books on the Marian appearances and the study of that, and I do talk about it in the book as probably the best parallel, I think, to look at. A lot of the parallels that the skeptics bring up are just laughable when they try to parallel those things to the resurrection of Jesus, like the Apollonius of Tyana. If you ever heard of him, this supposed magician and philosopher. We have his biography, again, hundreds of years after he lived. And so it sounds like they're trying to copy off the resurrection appearances of Jesus with him. And so there's just really no foundation for it. But the claims that Mary appeared to people, and as you said, in some cases, thousands of people maybe saw her at the same time, the Fatima. There's some really incredible ones. I think some of them the evidence is very flimsy, especially some of the earlier ones from the 16th century. Some of the Juan Diego one is considered kind of one of the first most significant ones. But I would say the fundamental difference is the unexpectedness of the resurrection of Jesus versus appearances of Mary. We see when you study church history, you find that all throughout, from early on, people are believing that angels appeared to them, in visions, or the apostles, sometimes Paul or Peter, appear to them in visions and speak to them. We find this throughout the literature. And so whether or not those happen, it makes sense that eventually somebody's going to say, the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, appeared to me, or that they saw her at one of these shrines, like you said, especially when she's exalted so high in certain traditions, like in the Roman Catholic tradition. So I think that's the key difference, is the unexpectedness. It makes sense to me why eventually people would start to think they are seeing Mary, whether they are or not. That just makes sense to me. But with Jesus, there was no expectation. There was no category. There was no category for a resurrected Messiah, for a resurrected anyone rising from the dead in the middle of history and appearing to them. And they had categories for ghosts, for apparitions, for exaltation, for exalted prophets, the Maccabean martyrs. They died. They said they were exalted to heaven. We even have in the New Testament, Revelation 11, the two witnesses who die, they're exalted to heaven and glory, right? Why didn't they say that about Jesus? They didn't say that about Jesus. They said that Jesus was resurrected. And this is that Daniel language, that what Jews believed would happen at the end of the world. So it was just a completely unexpected thing. So how do you explain their language of resurrection? And so I think when I parallel that to the Marian appearances, that's the key difference, I think, is the unexpectedness. But it is fun to point out. I like to point this out, especially if I'm dealing with a skeptic. If Mary is actually appearing to people, that actually supports the resurrection of Jesus, and it just means that we all need to become Catholic.
There you go. There you go. So in talking about no category, you talk about the Maccabeans and there was other Christ-like figures, I want to say, and I say the word Christ-like with air quotes for those on the podcast who can't see my fingers doing the air quote thing. That would come before, that were false messiahs, that would give spectacular words, those kinds of things that came, the kind of precursors to the Christ, Jesus, who shows up. Are their stories so radically different? You talked about, I want to say in one of the interviews that I had listened to, that there was there's no expectation for a resurrection of any of these messiahs.
Right.
But can you contrast that with like the popular, this is just a retold Egyptian myth, right? That the Jews had took, and they're incorporating some other myth from Horus or whatever Egyptian god has died and risen from the dead. Can you maybe explain some of that to us?
Yeah. Well, even like the Egyptian myth. I mean, Osiris, who is the key one that's picked to imitate Jesus. I mean, he rises from the dead in the sense of he's now Lord of the underworld, and in no way is this physical. In no way is this back in this world. It's just not Jewish. I mean,
that doesn't sound very risen from the dead.
Yes, exactly.
Kind of like he stayed in the dead place.
He's like mostly dead. He's not totally dead. He's just mostly dead.
So good.
It's a good quote. Sorry.
Well done. Trevinger Mettinger, Mettinger, he wrote this book on the dying and rising gods, and he basically is the definitive scholar on that, and he makes clear that the resurrection of Jesus is absolutely unique in the history of religions. These few that you can parallel, that people parallel him to, is really nothing like the Jewish idea of resurrection and the claim of the resurrection of Jesus. And this is what's amazing. We can actually, like you mentioned, these messianic pretenders that basically that Josephus tells us about, Philo of Alexandria tells us about. We know about them from many different writings, and they were basically right before Jesus, contemporary with Jesus, and a little bit after Jesus. And there's at least 14 of them by my count. And they basically are very similar to Jesus and John the Baptist. I'm not even counting John the Baptist. They basically have a charismatic personality. They made some sort of claim to be king or Messiah, something like that. They gathered disciples around themselves. But in all those cases, they would fight against Rome. They actually tried to usurp Rome's authority by physical violence. And the leader would either disappear, get put in prison, or get beheaded, get killed in some way, crucified in some cases. And after that, the movement disappeared. It came to nothing. Their followers went out and got jobs. And so why did none of them say their leader rose from the dead? I mean, that's, again, it shows that there's just there was no expectation of that. This was not a normal lie that the Jews would use. Oh, well, if our leader dies, we'll just say he rose from the dead and then we can keep going. No one did that. It was only the early Christians that said this about their leader. And what's interesting, if the Gospels are historically accurate, in every way, they are looking at the death of Jesus just like all these other followers looked at the death of their leader. They are convinced it's over. Jesus was not the Messiah. We had thought he was going to redeem Israel, but instead he was crucified. And they're cowering in the other rooms. They're in every way not believing that Jesus is the Messiah at this point. They're convinced it's over. And then something radically happens that completely transforms the world. So I think when we compare Jesus to those other movements, that it even more pushes us towards this supernatural event. It pushes us towards the resurrection, I think.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that we have to understand just kind of what you've been discussing and how we really have to understand the resurrection in the Jewish context, because you mentioned, like in the book of, I think you mentioned the book of Daniel 12:2, where it does talk about resurrection. And so there was, you can see this in the Gospels. Like the Sadducees didn't think there was a resurrection. The Pharisees did think there was a resurrection. But those who did think there was a resurrection all thought it was at the very end. Like no one had a grid for just kind of in the middle of everything, some dude just rises from the grave. And so we definitely have to take that into account. But what I want to do is I want to kind of push back like I'm a skeptic. Obviously, I'm not a skeptic, but I want to come to the idea of hallucination. And someone in our comments mentioned this, but is it possible to have a group hallucination? Is it possible that that even like, Peter, this magnificent leader, he has a hallucination? Or maybe it's even a ghost. You can address both of those. But he has some kind of weird supernatural deal, and he convinces all his friends, and it's just really wishful thinking that catches on contagiously. What's the likelihood of that?
Unlikely. So my favorite go-to source on this is, and I cite it in the book, but Dale Allison is a great, more not liberal, but definitely, liberal scholars across the board definitely respect him greatly. Dale Allison, he wrote a book called Resurrecting Jesus. It seems he believes that Jesus rose from the dead, but he wants to couch it. He wouldn't say it the same way we would say it, but he definitely believes the evidence is very powerful, and he actually surveys the literature on hallucinations that we have, scientific literature, and this is mainly like bereavement accounts, like people who just believe that their dead loved one, has come to visit them in some way. There's tons of literature on this, and he surveys it all. I mean, he serves probably not all, but he surveys it in a very exhaustive way, and he comes to four things emerged from his study that never happen or rarely happen in hallucinations. One is they're rarely ever seen by multiple people in groups over an extended period of time, like we have with Jesus appearing to Peter, and then the 12, and then 500 at one time, and then Paul almost a year and a half to 2 years later. So you have almost a 2-year period where Jesus is appearing to people, these unique resurrection appearances. Also, as far as a large group in the literature, 8 was the most that he found, of a group of 8 people at the same time saying that they saw a hallucination, compared to 12, compared to 500. Also, what never happens is the hallucination of a dead person that's been resurrected. Again, this language of resurrection is absolutely unique in the example of Jesus. And then again, Paul, like you use those examples with Peter and some of Jesus's disciples, but it just doesn't work at all with Paul, because Paul was an enemy. And in the literature, never does someone hallucinate an enemy, your enemy appearing to you. That's never happened in the literature. And you could also mention the fact that no world movement or world religion was launched from any of these hallucinations in the bereavement literature. So in all these cases, I think it just shows how unique the case of Jesus is. And if you bring in the Gospels, this is just from Paul, but if you bring in the Gospels, you also Dale Allison also shows that there's nothing in the literature about eating, the apparition eating, eating like fish and things like that. And of course, they don't look for an empty tomb. Like when someone has a vision of their grandmother dies, and then they have a vision, they feel like they're present. They don't go to the graveyard that they just had to
dig it up
and look for an empty tomb. Oh, maybe grandma's missing. Maybe grandma came out of the tomb. They don't do that. And so in all these cases, you have this uniqueness with the claim of Jesus, and I think it's just unlike anything that we have on at least on record for apparitions and hallucinations. Interestingly, just one more point, Bart Ehrman used to say he used to follow the hallucination theory, but it's interesting in his more recent book, how Jesus became God. He actually just punts to I don't know what happened. So he gets to the point of I know these people believe they saw Jesus. They believed it with all their heart. I know they believed it. Did he rise from the dead? I don't know. I just don't know. And but so I think that's the most intellectually honest,
because he's like, it seems like Bart Ehrman agrees with everything you agree with historically, except he's just willing to say, I don't know.
Wait a second. Didn't you debate him? Have you converted Bart Ehrman? No, I'm just kidding. You heard it here first, guys. No, I'm just kidding.
God willing, the Holy Spirit will convert.
Amen.
Hey,
Maybe, Lord. Maybe,
there
Lord.
it is. There, that's a good save right there.
But we did have a great debate. It was wonderful.
Yeah, I'd encourage people. I'll link it in the description. People can go watch it.
Yeah.
No one was expecting the resurrection, is what you talked about. You mentioned that these earlier these false Christs that were coming into the world, they were no one was expecting them to rise from the dead. But I've also heard people do kind of apologetic conversations and debates with Jewish scholars, and they're saying the same thing about Jesus. They were saying, hey, we were never expecting a Messiah to die for our sins and to rise from the dead. And then I hear those Christian apologists go, but there were a few of these rabbis, a few of these teachers who did expect the Messiah to die and then rise from the dead, even though they were sparse. Is that true?
Really?
Have you found that
I
in
never
your
heard
research?
that. Interesting.
Yeah, what you could be referencing, I would disagree if anyone was saying there was any expectation for that, because I don't see that at all in the literature. I think that's pretty definitive that we don't have any language, any writings contemporary with the New Testament or before that has that kind of expectation. Now, what I would say, and this would be my tactic with a Jewish believer who believed in the Old Testament, I would say, okay, yes, you're right. They didn't have that specific expectation for the Messiah, but let's go back to Isaiah 53. Let's go back to Daniel 9 that said this Messiah, it actually uses the word, the Mashiach, this Messiah will be cut off, the language of violent death. And then after that, it says the temple in Jerusalem will be destroyed. When did that happen in history? When did the temple in Jerusalem, when was it destroyed since the writing of Daniel? It was destroyed in AD 70. And did anybody show up before that might have been the Messiah that suffered a violent death? and so I would point to the prophecies. I know a guy, because that ultimately what it is. I think what happened is nobody expected it to be exactly the way it happened with Jesus. And then when Jesus did it, he went back and explained to his apostles, hey, look at the scriptures. It always was going to happen this way. You just didn't read it right. Look at Isaiah 53. Look at Daniel 9. Look at Micah 5. Look at Zechariah 9 and Zechariah 12. He went through the scriptures with them. This is what Luke tells us in Acts chapter 1, that he spent 40 days explaining to them the kingdom of God. And Luke 24 says he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. So I think that's now how we should approach it with anyone who accepts the Old Testament scriptures. We should take them to those passages and say, okay, who's this talking about? In Isaiah 53, it says that he will bear the sins of the nation. Who is this talking about? It says he will, by his wounds, they are healed. Who is this talking about? And so it goes back to the discussion with the Ethiopian eunuch, remember, with Philip. He said, is this talking about the prophet or someone else? We need to explain that he's talking about someone else. He's talking about this Jesus who fulfilled all those prophecies. So that would be how I would approach that. But I would
Okay.
agree in that sense. You can go back and say, no, it did say that, but no one was understanding it that way at the time.
Okay, so we've had the resurrection, we've had these appearances, and from this we have the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, which today has now become, what, 2 billion Christians? So could you talk to us about the rise of Christianity and what makes this unique? Because in your book, you talk about it as actually part of the evidence for the validity of Christianity, where a skeptic might say, well, Islam, started small and grew big, and Buddhism started small and grew big, and every religion starts small and grows big. So what's so significant about Christianity? What's so unique about it, different from the world religions?
Yeah, I do. I spend the last few chapters making this point. Not only the rise of Christianity in the midst of the place where Jesus was crucified, the origin of the Christian movement. I think that's a powerhouse question to ask. How did it even come about? But also, it went on to triumph and to overtake the Roman Empire and become, still to this day, the largest religion of the world. But right at about a third of the world at least professes to follow Jesus. Roman Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, all the denominations cover about 2.5 billion people, about a third of the world. And I use this hypothetical in the book. I basically say, if Jesus did in fact rise from the dead in history, if he's still alive and Lord of the world, what would we expect? What would we expect in our world? Would we expect his movement to fail or to succeed? Would we expect, as he said, the gospel, Jesus said, according to the gospel, this gospel will go to all nations and then the end will come. So if Jesus rose from the dead, should we expect the gospel just to stay there in Jerusalem for the last 2,000 years? Or should it go to every nation on the planet? Well, I mean, it's fascinating. We have 2,000 years of hindsight. I mean, if I had lived before Constantine, it would have been harder to convince me probably on this argument. But now that we have 2,000 years hindsight, I look around at the world, I look at history, and I'm like, wow, this looks like a world where Jesus rose from the dead. I mentioned in the book how the atheist Sam Harris, he has this discussion in one of his podcasts about time traveling, and he says, I'd like to, if I could go somewhere in history, who would you want to talk to? And one of the ladies, actually a Jewish intellectual he's talking to, she says, I'd like to go back and meet with Jesus. I want to know what was going on, what was happening at that time. And Sam Harris said, yeah, I actually want to meet Jesus too. He'd be on top of my list because I want to know, why does he have such sway over a large portion of the world? And that's the question right there. Why does Jesus still have such sway over a large portion of the world? Maybe it's because he rose from the dead 2,000 years ago. He's still alive. He's Lord of the world, and he's still actively transforming people, cities, nations, continents, and I think that's exactly what we do see. Now compare it to some of the other religions. I think that's an important point. Some of the other religions from the ancient world have survived, and some of them have done really well as far as numbers and advancement. But I like to compare it to Hinduism, for example. Hinduism has never really gone beyond the borders of India. I mean, it's a fascinating thing. If you look at Hinduism, that goes back to if their claims are right, 3,000 plus years ago. Why is it that 99% of Hindus have always stayed in India? I mean, you'd think if Krishna was the true God, if worshiping Krishna or Shiva, if you think that was the true religion, you'd think somebody in South America eventually would convert to Hinduism. And I'm sure maybe one or two have, but you see the point. The vast majority of the world has not in any way converted to Hinduism. We're talking 99% of Hindus have always been, and throughout that 3,000 year period, in India. So it looks like a religion that's basically Indian. It looks like a religion that arose from the ground up, man-made in India, and it never left because it didn't capture the hearts and minds from anyone else beyond that. Islam it's the only other religion I would say that has the claim of being kind of a successful world religion. It's really gone to multiple different nations. But I think when we compare Christianity and Islam, we compare the origins and we compare how they spread. And when you look at Islam, when Muhammad died, who did carry a sword and led armies into nations and conquered, when he died, he had thousands upon thousands of followers, and he had conquered many nations. So I think when he died, and for his movement to continue is no greater surprise to the historian than when Genghis Khan died and his movement kept going and conquering. That's exactly what we see in Islam. It spread so fast and so far because it spread by military conquering. Now, compare that to Jesus. When he died on the cross, how many nations had he conquered? I mean, how many followers did Jesus actually have when he was hanging on that cross and died? I mean, maybe John was there and maybe some brave women that are still following him. That's about it. You're going to conquer the world with that? So the rise and the dominance of Christianity, at least pre-Constantine, I find truly miraculous. And I would recommend to your listeners Tom Holland's book, the British historian, Dominion, which came out in 2019. Best book I read in 2019, one of the best books to be written in a while on church history. And he just shows how Christianity just went around and dominated the world, and it still dominates really almost all of our conversations today. All these things that we think are secular values really are ultimately Christian. We're swimming in the sea of Christianity, and we just don't even know it. And that's basically his argument. And he's, by the way, pretty much become a Christian since writing that book. He was actually an atheist, and he's seemingly, it sounds like he's converted to Christianity since he wrote that book. In his most recent podcast with a guy from England, Glenn Scrivener, I think his name.
So it's obvious, if you're going to ask a person, like if you were on an elevator with someone and you were going down the elevator and you had like 2 minutes to give a pitch about the proof and validity of Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection, they would just say, "Hey, go check out Remnant Radio." I mean, that's obviously the easiest way to do it.
It's the number one way. Yeah.
The number one way. But if there was a secondary way that you had to use your own words and describe in 2 minutes, this is the proof. This is the historical evidence. How would you advise people to kind of communicate that in a short period, concise period of time?
That's a great question, and I've had many opportunities like that where you have just that short amount of time, and I would say, I mean I like just the simple question about Jesus, just asking them, who do they think Jesus was, is, who do you think Jesus is? I mean, look at his movement, look at how it's overtaken the world. Who was this man? Who was this crucified man? He claimed to be God. Who was he? So I would like to just ask some questions, about Jesus. But if I was going to make the case for the resurrection, if I had a little bit of time and they were open to that, I would want to really just make the case that the apostles made. And we see how the apostles made this case, not just in Paul's letters, but also like in the sermons and Acts. And in all those proclamations, they're constantly pointing to the eyewitness testimony. So they're constantly saying, like Paul is constantly saying, I saw him. I saw him. Peter and James, they also saw him. James was his own brother. Peter was his primary disciple. They saw him too. His 12 disciples that went around following him, minus Judas. Judas left, but his 11 disciples that followed him, they saw him too. And even more than 500 at one time saw him. And some of them are still alive. You can go talk to them. So it's that continuous eyewitness testimony of these 500 plus eyewitnesses. And even if you take away the 500, like we were talking about, you still have multiple eyewitnesses that we know sealed their testimony with their blood. They were willing to give their lives for this belief. I would want to put that little pebble in the skeptic's shoe and say, what did they see? What did they see? What did Paul see? What did Peter see? It transformed their lives. Could this Jesus transform your life? Is he alive? If he is alive, this is everything you would want to be true. You want there to be immortality. You want there to be forgiveness of sins. You want there to be true justice, true beauty. So I think in every way we want to make them wish it were true and then prove to them that it is true. That's the great Pascalian, Blaise Pascal. That was his mission in Enlightenment France of the 17th century. He said, I want to make unbelievers wish it were true and then prove to them that it is true. And so I like that model.
That's great. Hey, we have linked the two books, both Justin's book and the book that he recommended from Holland in the description. They're affiliate links. You can click on those, purchase those books. It will help out our channel, and it will help out the authors who have published those books. I would encourage you as well.
Holland's book.
Say it again?
Holland's book is better than mine.
Okay, well, yeah, both are in the description. I also linked the debate that he had with Bart Ehrman, and some of you were asking, hey, we would like to see that debate. That's in the description of the video as well. And if you want to go and support the channel, we do have donation links for Patreon and those kinds of things and special content that comes out there. We didn't mention that at the top of the show, and I typically do that. But we're kind of at the end of our program where we typically do some closing thoughts. So I would just ask everyone, and I know that it might be difficult since Justin just gave his elevator pitch, but what's that golden nugget as people are walking away that you want them to remember as they're kind of going about their day and their week? What's that last little nugget you would want them to remember? And I'll start with Michael, and then I'll toss it over to Justin.
Yeah, there's so much. I love the way that Christianity is unique and that we don't just worship a God that gave us a book. We don't just worship a God that gave us some doctrine and some dogma. We don't just worship a God that handed over some tradition. We worship a God who actually invaded history and time. And I think sometimes we as Christians lose that, but like this is like a real story that happened. Our faith is rooted in history. It's not just Muhammad coming and telling you about a God, and it's not just Buddha coming and giving you some noble truths. And it's a God who came into history. And I love just kind of flowering out from that. If you expect if this really happened, you would expect it to become a global phenomenon. The fact that it started so small and it shouldn't have had any chance, and yet look how far it spread, not just in numbers, but you talked about the diversity within the Christian religion. And when you look at Islam, the diversity isn't there. You have a lot of Middle Eastern Muslims, you have some African Muslims or African American, but you don't have the diversity. I mean, not to say that there aren't any white Muslims, but there's not that many. When you look at Christianity, it's exploding in China. It's exploding in India. It's exploding. I mean, it already exploded and took over the West. And so it's every tongue, tribe, and nation, just as you would expect. So I don't know. I just said a bunch of stuff, but all that stuff's just kind of flooding my mind. And I having read that book and then getting to interact with you, Justin, a real privilege. It blows my mind as well as deepening my faith. So really just appreciative for what you're bringing.
What are some thoughts, Justin?
Praise the Lord. Yeah, I would just continuing a little bit of what I was saying before. I'm fascinated listening to people like Tom Holland, who converted to Christianity just recently, but other just great intellectuals that are speaking out these days, that like Douglas Murray, Jordan Peterson. There's just a lot of people out there speaking on these issues of meaning and purpose, forgiveness, hope. In this time in 2020, we need hope more than ever. And we just can't get away from the fact, the practicality and the beauty of the gospel, and that if Jesus did rise from the dead, we have meaning and purpose. Every single second of our life has meaning. I mean, Paul ends 1 Corinthians 15 that way. We know your labor is not in vain. And that's because of everything he said before that. Everything he said before that about the resurrection of Jesus. Because of that, we know everything that we do in life actually has meaning, actually has purpose. We know that we are forgiven if we trust in Jesus. We know that because he rose from the dead, he also hung on that cross and died for our sins. And we also know we have hope. If Jesus rose from the dead, then we also will rise, and we also will be a part of that new heavens and new earth, and that new creation has already begun. And so I just think the actual application of if Jesus rose from the dead, so what? I mean, that's the so what. It's the beauty of the gospel. Praise God, it's true. And I'm glad other religions aren't true. I'm really happy about that, to be honest. I really don't want them to be true. I want Christianity to be true, but I really don't want Mormonism to be true. I'm going to be very disappointed if it is.
Yeah, agreed. Hey, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was an honor to have you with us today. For those of you who are watching, make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you haven't subscribed already, make sure to like the channel so that you get notifications when we come out with more content just like this. We've got really exciting episodes coming down the pipe. We've got Mike Winger coming on to talk about the Passion Translation. We've got Max Lucado talking about coming into the gifts of the Spirit. We've got a lot of really crazy, unique interviews that the Lord's been opening some doors. So you want to make sure that you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of it. Anyway, we'll see you next Monday night, 8:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, or Tuesday from 4 to 5.
Or
Michael?
on Wednesday, the next Todd White interview
Oh,
is
yeah.
released,
That's
talking
tomorrow.
about Christian suffering. So that'll be released tomorrow at 4 p.m. It's 10 minutes long or so.
Yeah.
Just a little snippet. So anyway, so make sure you guys subscribe so you can get all that content, and sign up for Patreon, support the channel, and help us continue doing what we're doing.
Yep.
Thanks so much for joining us, guys. God bless you.
Peace.